Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 50 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is A Lesser Known Simon. There are Simons all over the place in the New Testament. There's the most famous one, Simon Peter, the disciple of Jesus turned leader of the early Christ-following movement. There's Simon the leper in Mark chapter 14, who becomes Simon the Pharisee in Luke chapter 7. There's Jesus' brother Simon, mentioned in Mark chapter 6. There's Simon of Cyrene, who bears Jesus' cross in Mark chapter 15. There's Simon Iscariot, the father of Judas Iscariot. There's Simon the magician in Acts chapter 8, and Simon the tanner in Acts chapter 10. There are a lot of Simons. One of the lesser-known Simons was, like Simon Peter, a disciple of Jesus. According to Mark chapter 3, verse 18, he was known as Simon the Cananaean. But what does Cananaean mean? As you might have expected, Cananaean is a transliteration of the Greek word Kananaion. But in and of itself, this gives us very little with which to determine its meaning. It almost sounds like Canaanite. So, is this Simon the Canaanite? Or maybe it's a reference to the town of Cana in Galilee. So, is this Simon a man from Cana? Or is there something else going on? The first option, Simon the Canaanite, can be ruled out almost right away. Though in English, Cananaean and Canaanite sound similar, in Greek they begin with two different letters. Kananaios begins with the Greek letter kappa, while the word for Canaanite, Kananaios, begins with the Greek letter chi. So, these are two different words. The second option cannot be quite so easily ruled out. If you're reading in a Greek manuscript like Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century CE, you won't read of Simon the Cananaean, but of Simon Cananitein, Simon the Canaanite, or man from Cana, a town in Galilee. This is the reading that appears in the Textus Receptus, the Greek text upon which the King James and New King James versions are based. But interestingly, the translators of the KJV don't render Cananitain as Canaanite, that is, one from the town of Cana, but as Canaanite, one from the land of Canaan. That's not what the word means, and the New King James Version renders the term correctly, Canaanite, one from Cana. But is the reading referring to the town of Cana what originally appeared in the Gospel of Mark? Probably not. For starters, the reading Cananaean is older, appearing in two of our most important witnesses, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Another reason to prefer Cananaean over Canaanite is how Luke, who used Mark's Gospel as one of his sources, renders the term. Here is Luke chapter 6, verse 15, as it appears in the New Revised Standard Version. And Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot. Where does Luke get zealot from Cananaean? While most translations transliterate Mark's Cananaeon, Luke seemingly translates it. He must think that Cananaeon refers to zealousness or being a zealot. But why? As it turns out, there's a pretty good reason why. The Aramaic word for zealous is kanan. If Cananaeon was originally an Aramaic word translated from Aramaic to Greek by Mark, or one of his sources, then we have an explanation for why Luke in turn renders it with the Greek word zelotes. Luke is simply translating Mark's transliteration. But to what does this zealousness refer? In the past, some interpreters have understood it as a reference to a political party known as the Zealots. Adela Yarbrough Collins, in her commentary on Mark's Gospel, points to an entry in the 3rd edition of the popular Greek language tool, A Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament and Other Early Christian Literature, known as BDAG for its editors. There, in the entry for Kananios, we are told that Simon had this surname probably because he had formerly belonged to the party of the Zealots, or freedom fighters. They then cite a few scholars who have advocated for such a view. However, there is a significant difficulty with this. Mentioned in the works of Josephus, the Zealots were a group of rebels who were active during the Jewish War. In their book, Bandits, Prophets, and Messiahs, Richard Horsley and John Hanson explained that this group arose in response to Roman oppression during the war. Only when the devastating advance of the Roman legions left no alternatives but flight and resistance did these peasants from northwestern Judea form brigand bands which, once they took refuge in Jerusalem, emerged as an organized coalition, they write. They also note that militarily they were virtually inconsequential, but they did manage to accomplish one thing. In the words of Horsley and Hanson, they challenged and rendered ineffective the government of the chief priests and leading Pharisees who had been attempting to reach an accommodation with the Romans. You may have picked up on precisely why the idea that Simon was a member of the Zealots is problematic. If Simon was a disciple of Jesus in the late 20s and early 30s CE, and the Zealots did not form until the late 60s, well, he could not have been a member of a group that didn't exist. And so, we are left to explain what the zealousness referred to. Adela Yarbrough Collins has a really good answer. She writes, "The notion of zeal is closely related to that of jealousy. The Hebrew word, kaf nun aleph, is used in both senses. The idea that Yahweh is a jealous God is closely related to the command to worship him alone. Thus, a zealous Israelite was one who strongly opposed the worship of any other deity. During the Second Temple period, the focus of zeal was extended to include all offenses against the law. Those who were zealous in this sense would endure any hardship, even death, rather than transgress the law. Some would take it upon themselves to punish transgressors of the law, and Simon, the disciple of Jesus, may have earned his epithet by doing so." It is difficult to know whether Jesus truly had a disciple by the name of Simon the Zealot. Our singular source for this is the Gospel of Mark. Both Matthew and Luke have Mark as their source. The existence of Simon doesn't pass one of the typical criteria for historical authenticity, namely that of multiple, independent attestation. For the existence of Simon the Cananean, or Zealot, then Mark's voice is where it all begins. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.